On August 10th, 2019, the world's most notorious inmate was found dead inside a maximum security prison cell. The official verdict was suicide, but millions of people believe he was murdered to protect the secrets of the global elite. For years, we've been trapped in a web of conspiracy theories, but now the truth has finally been unlocked. Following a massive declassification that unleashed pages of hidden prison records, the New York Times did what the government couldn't. They launched the most comprehensive investigation into Epstein's death ever conducted, combing through official reports, unsealed court files, and interviewing dozens of guards and inmates who had never spoken to the press before. What they uncovered rewrites the entire narrative of what happened inside that cell. My name is Jackson Buhai, your host of In the Know. Let's get right into it. Late in the afternoon of July 6, 2019, a dozen heavily armed federal agents and NYPD officers gathered inside a hangar at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. They weren't on the tarmac. They were hiding, staging out of view so they wouldn't spook their target. The day before, a quiet email had landed in their inboxes. A private Gulfstream jet was scheduled to touch down at exactly 5:20 p.m., returning from Paris. Attached to that email was a heavily sealed arrest warrant. The lone passenger they were looking for was Jeffrey Epstein. Up in the air, completely unaware of what was waiting for him on the ground, Epstein was busy on his phone, making plans. A trip to his private island in the Caribbean, a documentary interview with Steve Bannon. But the moment the wheels touched the asphalt, the trap snapped shut. Customs agent boarded the plane under the guise of a routine passport check. Within minutes, Epstein was escorted into the terminal where an FBI agent stepped forward and delivered the words that shattered his universe. "You are under arrest." Epstein was visibly shocked. He managed to fire off one final cryptic text to Bannon. "All cancelled." Bannon replied almost instantly, "You are not coming in?" There was no reply. As the FBI drove Epstein towards Manhattan, the billionaire broke his silence with two telling questions. Is this sex trafficking? And is this about underage? It was. For 8 months, federal prosecutors had been quietly building a brand new case, hunting for the victims Epstein thought he had successfully buried a decade earlier in Florida. This time, there would be no sweetheart plea deal. He was facing 45 years in prison. As he was processed into federal custody, the reality finally washed over him. He muttered aloud to the empty air, "Oh, this is bad. This is really bad." Just after 9 p.m., Epstein arrived at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the MCC, a notorious federal jail in Lower Manhattan. As he walked past the intake desk, a jail employee named Elba Torres noticed him. He looked distraught, sad, and deeply confused, according to Torres. She emailed the staff, writing that he seemed dazed and withdrawn, and warned them to get psychology involved immediately, just to prevent any suicidal thoughts. At that moment, nobody in the jail really understood who they had just locked up, but that internal memo captured one of the most stunning reversals of fortune in modern history. Hours earlier, Jeffrey Epstein was cocooned in a multi-million-dollar empire of luxury, wealth, and political influence that had, for decades, operated entirely above the law. Now, he was stripped of his clothes, handed a generic prison uniform, and reduced to a Bureau of Prisons number, 76318-054. It was the beginning of the 35-day journey into darkness for Jeffrey Epstein, a journey that would end on August 10th, 2019, when a guard found him hanging in his cell. Now, the New York City medical examiner officially ruled his death a suicide, but years later, the theory that Epstein didn't kill himself, that he was murdered to protect the secrets of the global elite, is a belief held by millions of people who agree on absolutely nothing else. The public distrust was so massive it eventually forced Congress to pass the Epstein Files Transparency Act, unlocking a massive treasure trove of classified data, more than 3 million pages of hidden documents, photos, and internal video. Two separate, exhaustive federal investigations concluded it was a suicide, but these newly unsealed records didn't put the rumors to bed. They raised entirely new questions, and that is where the New York Times steps in. Through lawsuits and investigative reporting, the New York Times launched the most comprehensive examination of Epstein's death ever conducted. Journalists tracked down and interviewed over 40 inmates, guards, and lawyers, and federal officials. Shockingly, many of these people had never been interviewed by journalists before. Some had never even been questioned by the official government investigators. What they uncovered rewrites the entire narrative of what happened inside the MCC. To understand how Jeffrey Epstein died, you have to understand the place where he lived. The MCC was a brutalist concrete monolith infamous for squalor and systematic failure. It was freezing in the summer, stiflingly hot in the winter, and overrun with contraband smuggled in by exhausted guards working brutal overtime shifts. The jail's most dangerous inmates, terrorists, mob hitmen, and El Chapo, were kept in an ultra-secure unit called 10 South, but for reasons that remain unclear, Epstein was never sent there. Instead, he was thrown into the general population of 5 North, a notoriously rough unit. The predators inside smelled blood immediately. Inmates recall a prisoner named Loco Tron cornering Epstein, trying to intimidate him and extort him for his money. Recognizing the extreme risk, the warden ordered Epstein moved to the special housing unit, the SHU. The SHU is a punitive isolation block where inmates are locked down 23 hours a day. It is highly restrictive and psychologically damaging, and because the jail used it as an ad hoc protective custody unit, it created a bizarre, dangerous paradox. It placed one of the jail's most vulnerable inmates in a tiny concrete room with one of its most violent. When the heavy metal steel door slammed shut, Epstein found himself sharing a cell with Nicholas Tartaglione, a muscular, shaved-head former police officer awaiting trial for a quadruple homicide. Terrified, Epstein pounded on the door, screaming for guards, but Tartaglione didn't hurt him. In fact, jail psychologists quickly realized that having a cellmate was actually keeping Epstein alive. Suicide is a private act, and prisoners are far less likely to try it when someone else is watching. Besides, in his early meetings with the jail's chief psychologist Alyssa Miller, Epstein blew off the idea that he was suicidal. He was entitled, confident, and obsessed with his upcoming bail hearing. He boasted about his massive business on the outside, smiled, and told her, "Being alive is fun." But on July 18th, the fantasy collapsed. A federal judge denied his bail. Epstein was officially staying behind bars. When Epstein walked back into his cell that afternoon, the entitlement was absolutely gone. He looked at Tartaglione and asked a sudden, chilling question. "How do you make a noose?" According to Tartaglione, over the next few days, he caught Epstein preparing to end his life twice. Once, trying to tie a bedsheet to the window grate. Another time, Tartaglione found a makeshift noose hidden flat under Epstein's mattress. He says he warned the guards, but they laughed it off. Epstein's only escape was the legal visit room. A rotating army of young lawyers sat with him for hours, acting less like legal counsel and more like highly paid companions just to keep him out of his cell. They watched him seethe over powerful friends who were publicly abandoning him, like Leslie Wexner, and saw him desperately trying to figure out if he had any leverage left over people like Bill Gates. According to the New York Times, Epstein was obsessed with finding dirt on Donald Trump, who was president at the time. Epstein sat with a legal pad, scribbling notes, trying to dredge up anything he could sell to prosecutors in exchange for leniency. But his notes show he had absolutely nothing. He just wrote phrases like, "Trump is a total con artist, smoke and mirrors, and never had money." His writings became increasingly dark, a fragmented window into a breaking mind. He wrote about the humiliation of being labeled a wealthy pedophile in jail. He complained about the constant screams in the SHU, the lack of sleep, and the lack of air. On July 22nd, he wrote one word in massive capital letters across the top of a page: "J'accuse." Hours later, at 1:27 a.m., guards heard a violent banging coming from his cell. Inside, they found Epstein on the floor, motionless, with an orange fabric noose wrapped around his neck. What actually happened that night remains fiercely disputed. Tartaglione claims he woke up, saw Epstein dangling, and used a hidden razor blade to cut him down, saving his life. But Epstein told a completely different story, claiming that Tartaglione had attacked him and tried to kill him. Jail officials were skeptical. They suspected Epstein was staging a fake suicide attempt to manipulate the system, trying to scare them into granting him house arrest. But there was one piece of evidence that proved Epstein was deadly serious, and the jail investigators never knew it existed. Hidden between the pages of a graphic novel inside the cell was a handwritten suicide note from Jeffrey Epstein. He wrote, "They investigated me for months, found nothing. It is a treat to be able to choose one's time to say goodbye. What you want me to do? Bust out crying? No fun, not worth it." Tartaglione didn't hand the note to the guards, he gave it to his own lawyers to prove he didn't attack Epstein. The note was sealed in court files, completely hidden from public view and federal investigators for years, until the New York Times successfully petitioned a federal judge to unseal it. It was entirely authentic, even containing obscure catchphrases from the Little Rascals that Epstein used to use in private emails to his family. In another unreleased note, Epstein wrote, "Only pain to me and others in the future. Not very much fun. Best for all." Because the jail psychologists never saw these notes, they severely underestimated the danger. They downgraded his suicide risk, took him off suicide watch, and on July 30th, they sent him back to the SHU. Now this time, he was placed in cell 220 with a new cellmate, Efren Reyes, a drug trafficking defendant who was cooperating with the government. Reyes watched as Epstein manipulated the guards, demanding extra pens and bedding, items strictly forbidden for safety reasons, but the guards gave them to him anyway, terrified of his legal team. The warnings were everywhere. The US Marshal Service officially flagged Epstein with an alert notice explicitly stating he was showing suicidal tendencies. And one night, Reyes woke up in the pitch black. He looked across the cell and saw Epstein fidgeting with a piece of fabric. It was a makeshift clothesline Reyes had crafted from a bedsheet. Reyes instantly realized what Epstein was doing. He grabbed the fabric, looked him in the eye, and said, "Bro, we are not doing this. I have a chance to go home soon." Reyes took the sheet, walked over to the toilet, and flushed it away. But Reyes wouldn't be in that cell forever. Soon he was transferred out, and the institutional rot, human error, and sheer negligence of the MCC were about to align perfectly. The conspiracy theories surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's death imagine a flawless, high-level assassination, but the reality revealed by the documents is far more terrifying. A broken system that simply left the door wide open for a man who desperately wanted to die, and very soon his final opportunity would arrive. With Efren Reyes now watching him closely, Epstein insisted he never actually tried to kill himself. He claimed the whole thing with Tartaglione was just a misunderstanding, but in the quiet hours of the night, Epstein would stare at the concrete walls and wonder aloud how anyone could survive a life in prison. Reyes didn't buy it. He looked at the billionaire and warned him, "Don't try to kill yourself in this cell. I don't want to wake up and find you dead." Epstein's response was, "Don't worry, I'm never going to cause you trouble." With absolutely nothing to do, the two men spent their days doing what prisoners do best, surveying their captors. Cell 220 had a window that looked directly out at the guard's desk, and from that vantage point, Epstein and Reyes watched a masterclass in systemic rot. One morning, around 5 a.m., Reyes woke up to smoke a cigarette. He looked out the window and saw the guards completely asleep, huddled under orange inmate blankets to shield themselves from the freezing air conditioning. Reyes nudged Epstein and said, "Look, they're using our blankets. They're asleep." Epstein just stared at them. He said, "Incredible." But the reality of his situation was closing in. Reyes kept pressing him about why a man with his kind of money would ever want to end it. "You can pay for protection," Reyes argued. But Epstein felt completely exposed. He told Reyes that during his brief stint in the general population of 5 North, he had been extorted immediately. "They threw me to the wolves," he said. And as for his legal battle, Epstein knew the game was over. He told Reyes the federal government was furious about the lenient plea deal he had managed to secure in Florida a decade earlier. They weren't going to let him slide again. "I know I'm never going to see the street again," Epstein admitted. He looked around the cramped, squalid cage and muttered, "This is no way to live." On the morning of August 9th, Efren Reyes was suddenly transferred out of the MCC to a private facility in Queens. He knew the danger Epstein was in. As he was being led off the tier for the last time, Reyes actually stopped a jail staff member and pleaded with them, "Get him a good bunkie. He's not good to be alone." Jail management knew this too. Because of his severe suicide risk, the chief psychologist had issued a strict order. Epstein was to be housed with another inmate at all times. Throughout the day on August 9th, multiple corrections officers noted that Epstein's cell was empty. They noted it, they claimed they passed the information up the chain, but nobody did a single thing to fix it. To make matters worse, that very morning, a massive cache of highly damaging documents was unsealed in a public defamation lawsuit. Files detailing the horrific extent of his crimes were suddenly splashed across the global news. Epstein met with his lawyers that afternoon. He ended the meeting earlier than usual. Later that evening, a jail supervisor named Nathaniel Bullock allowed Epstein to break protocol and make an unmonitored phone call. Epstein claimed he needed to call his mother. Epstein's mother had been dead for 15 years. Instead, he dialed his girlfriend, Karina Shuliak. According to what her lawyers later told investigators, Epstein tried to sound reassuring. "They are trying to keep me safe," he said of the guards. But he warned her that his case was going to take much longer than expected. He told her that he wouldn't be able to call her again for at least a month. "Be strong," he told her. "I love you." When the guards escorted Jeffrey Epstein back to cell 220 after that final phone call, he walked inside and the heavy door slammed shut. There was no new cellmate waiting for him. He was entirely alone. The two officers assigned to the SHU that night were Tova Noel and Guito Bonham. Noel had been at the MCC for just over a year and had less than 2 months of experience in the SHU. She had zero specialized training for a high-risk unit, though she later admitted she was forced to sign documents saying she did. She was chronically exhausted, routinely working 16-hour shifts, sometimes dozing off at the wheel of her car on her drive home. This level of dangerous understaffing was standard practice at the MCC. Months earlier, the Corrections Officers Union president had sent a dire warning to the Bureau of Prisons, explicitly stating, "We are one incident away from a staff or inmate fatality." The week Epstein died, 11 guards called out. The jail was so desperate that supervisors ordered Noel, who was already finishing a grueling shift at midnight, to stay and work the entire overnight shift too. Shortly after 10 p.m., Noel conducted her mandatory rounds, walking past the cells to verify the inmates were alive. When she passed cell 220, Epstein called out through the door, asking her to plug in his CPAP breathing machine. She plugged it in, turned, and walked away. That was the last time anyone would acknowledge seeing Jeffrey Epstein alive. What happened over the next 8 hours is shrouded in a cloud of broken technology and human negligence. The SHU was equipped with 11 cameras designed to cover every corridor in human space, but a week earlier, technicians discovered a catastrophic hardware failure. Nearly half of the cameras were not recording. Replacement hard drives had actually arrived that very day, but nobody had bothered to install them. As a result, only 2 cameras were functional in the entire unit. One of them captured a wide shot of the guard's desk and just a tiny sliver of the staircase leading up to the locked door of Epstein's tier. The footage from this camera is low resolution, blurry, and incredibly frustrating, but at exactly 10:40 p.m., the camera caught something in the corner of the frame, an indistinct orange shape moving up the stairs towards Epstein's tier. Because the footage is so poor, it has become one of the greatest mysteries of the Epstein saga. An FBI investigator reviewing the tape wrote in his notes that the blur could possibly be an inmate escorted up to that tier. Now, for conspiracy theorists, this was the definitive proof. An assassin slipping into the darkness to kill the world's most infamous inmate. When midnight hit, Officer Bonham's shift ended, and he was replaced by Michael Thomas, a 12-year veteran who was currently working his 3rd consecutive shift just to keep up with rent and child support payments. Thomas wasn't even a guard. He worked in the laundry and commissary, but the jail was so short-staffed that they were using clerical workers and supply guys to guard high-risk prisoners. The guards knew exactly who was in cell 220. In fact, someone had taped a cynical handwritten sign directly onto the computer monitor at the guard's desk. It read, "Mandatory rounds must be conducted every 30 minutes on Epstein, number 76318-054, as per God." But according to Officer Noel, when she tried to initiate a midnight head count, Thomas brushed her off, pulling his hoodie over his face, and went straight to sleep. The SHU was supposed to be a tomb, but sound traveled easily between the concrete cells. Inmates could hear their neighbors' every move. Locked in the cell right next to Epstein that night was an inmate named Chad Brown. Brown was awake late into the night when he suddenly heard a distinct, unsettling noise coming through the wall. It sounded like someone violently ripping bedsheets. Sensing what was happening, Brown tried to shout through the wall to distract him. "Hey, do you have any postage stamps I can use?" Through the concrete, Epstein's voice came back. "I didn't order any stamps." Then, the tearing sound started again. It continued in the dark for about 10 minutes, and then everything went dead silent. From 1 a.m., until 2:44 a.m., the functional security camera captured Noel and Thomas sitting at the guard's desk, and for nearly 2 hours, neither of them moved a single muscle. Investigators concluded they were fast asleep. At 6:30 a.m., the morning sun began to hit the MCC. Officer Thomas began rolling the breakfast cart down the tier. When he reached cell 220, he looked through the narrow window and saw Epstein motionless. He yelled for him to come to the door. No response. Thomas unlocked the steel door and stepped inside. Jeffrey Epstein was hanging from a fabric noose tied to the frame of the lower bunk bed. His body was suspended just an inch off the floor. Thomas frantically tore the body down and screamed for Noel. Noel slammed the emergency alarm as Thomas knelt over the billionaire, desperately pumping his chest. In the panic of the moment, Thomas cried out the brutal truth. "Breathe, Epstein. Breathe. We're going to be in so much trouble." Early that morning, the phone rang for Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. A U.S. Marshal delivered the news. Jeffrey Epstein was dead. Berman was riddled with rage. His office had spent 9 meticulous months building a flawless case to ensure Epstein could never wriggle free from justice again, and now the system had let him slip away anyway. Berman fumed to his wife. "The MCC has one job to keep our defendants safe, and they can't even get that right with their most famous inmate." When Attorney General Bill Barr received the news in Washington, his chief of staff didn't mince words. He told Barr the MCC was an absolute shit show. But when the FBI finally entered the cell 7 hours later, the scene they found was a total disaster. The cell was choked with heaps of extra linen Epstein was never supposed to have, alongside multiple makeshift nooses and torn strips of orange fabric. Worse, the response had completely contaminated the scene. The jail staff and paramedics had trampled through the room so thoroughly that forensic teams didn't even bother to log DNA samples. And then they made a critical, irreversible error. They logged the wrong noose into evidence. They grabbed a wide strip of fabric but missed a second tightly twisted loop that had been kicked into a far corner during the medical chaos. A loop that had showed deep creases, indicating it had actually borne weight. By the time anyone realized the mistake, that second loop had already been thrown into the trash. This monumental screw-up fueled a firestorm of public doubt. Officer Noel and Officer Thomas were quickly indicted for falsifying records because while they hadn't performed a single check all night, they had signed federal forms swearing they had. But what about that mysterious orange blur on the stairs at 10:40 p.m.? The Justice Department Inspector General launched a years-long investigation to track it down. Ultimately, they concluded the blur wasn't a shadowy assassin. It was almost certainly Officer Noel herself carrying orange inmate linens up the tier. To pull off an actual assassination inside the shoe would have required an almost impossible level of orchestration. A killer would need to pass multiple real-time cameras monitored by a separate control center, bypass biometric locks, and obtain 3 distinct physical keys guarded at all times by the desk officers. It would require a massive, flawless network of dozens of conspirators willing to face the death penalty. As the head of the Bureau of Prisons later put it, it would have taken a massive conspiracy that I can't imagine somebody not finding out about. Too many people would have been involved. The true fatal flaw wasn't a hit squad, it was the fact that multiple supervisors had been explicitly warned that Epstein's cellmate was leaving, and yet they left a highly suicidal man alone in a room full of bedsheets. But the medical evidence remains fiercely contested to this day. The city's medical examiner officially ruled the death a suicide by hanging. But Mark Epstein, Jeffrey's brother, hired legendary pathologist Dr. Michael Baden to observe the autopsy. Baden emerged from the morgue with a completely different conclusion. He pointed directly to 3 distinct bone fractures in Epstein's neck. Baden went on national television and declared, "I think the evidence points towards homicide rather than suicide." He argued those specific fractures are classic signs of manual strangulation, not a self-inflicted hanging. The New York Times took that claim to 9 independent forensic pathologists. Their consensus? Medicine isn't a perfect science. In an older victim, those neck bones can easily fracture during a hanging. Independent experts explain that Epstein could have simply tied the fabric to the lower bunk frame, wrapped it around his neck, and knelt forward. The sheer weight of his head would cut off the blood flow to his brain, causing him to lose consciousness in seconds and die in minutes. Ultimately, the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's death offers a frustrating reality. It's a case where every question is far easier to ask than it is to answer. It became the ultimate petri dish for conspiracy theories, a dark space where nothing can ever be definitively proven wrong, as long as people want to believe in it. The last known image of Jeffrey Epstein alive is a tiny flickering fragment of security footage from the night of August 9th. He is being led back to cell 220 for the final time. In the video, he is nothing more than a silver flash of hair, visible for a mere fraction of a second. Stripped of his billionaire status, stripped of his global influence, reduced to a blurry phantom on a low-resolution screen. He is there, and then he is gone into the dark. My name is Jackson Buhai, your host of In the Know. Thank you so much for joining us.